Welcome. My name is Joshua Nicholas. I am a third year PhD student in the Department of Geography here at the University of Cambridge. I'm supervised by Amy Donovan, who's here today, and Clive Oppenheimer. So I'm just about to share my screen, and we will see if this works. There we go. Am I able to get a thumbs up from someone? Yep, fantastic. Wonderful. Okay. In that case, then I will assume all is good and I will crack on and have a little chat with you for the next 35, 40 minutes or so. So, the main topic of today will be my PhD research, looking at the role of trust in shaping disaster resilience. Now, there's quite a few things that I want us to break down before we really start to analyze this question in the context of Dominica in the Caribbean, which is where my research is based. So, step number one for us to break down is what is trust? If my research is trying to understand how does trust influence resilience in Dominica, then step number one is indeed what is trust? So the literature has quite a number of different ways of thinking about trust. The way that I generally try to break it down, as others have done as well, is that these are the three main ingredients that are required for something to be about trust. Number one, ability, meaning does a thing have the capacity, the knowledge, the skill, or the capability to do something? That's number one. Number two, intention. Does a thing have the benevolence, the goodwill, and the integrity to act? And the final piece is commitment. So, is there a mutually perceived commitment for a person to act in a certain way? So let's break down what this means, maybe with an example or two. So, for instance, I could say I trust my hairdresser, and the reason that I think that I can say that I trust my hairdresser is, first of all, there's, in my opinion, a commitment there. There is a mutually perceived commitment for my hairdresser to cut my hair. I can say that I trust my hairdresser in that capacity. I can't say that I trust my hairdresser to feed me when I go, because that's sort of not a commitment that we have. I can make some sort of an assessment as to their ability, less so maybe about their intention, though I might come to build a judgment on that over time. Um, some things aren't, in my opinion, matters of trust. I mean, if I said I don't trust, or like, can I trust my car to fly me to the moon? No, like it doesn't have the ability, that's not even part of the remit of what the car can do. Could I say that I trust my alarm clock to go off tomorrow? I would say no. I mean, the alarm clock doesn't really can't have intention, so it sort of fails in that capacity, but it also doesn't have a commitment. If anything, the commitment is with myself. Have I set the alarm clock? Have I charged my phone? But there's no commitment there. The point that I'm trying to make is that, to me, in my research, generally I think of commitment as being core to whether something is a matter of trust or not. Ability and or intention are then sort of also required. So that's for trust. I just very quickly, I want to say on the opposite, distrust. Just because you don't place trust in something doesn't mean that you distrust it. Just because I don't trust my car to fly me to the moon doesn't mean that I distrust the car. There's just no trust to begin with. I think we have to be very careful here, because a lot of the time it comes to do with commitment. Do I trust the Chancellor of the Exchequer to be able to cut my hair, or to cut my hair if I ever saw her? No. But it's not that I distrust her, it's just that it's not a matter of trust in the first place. And I think that this is interesting because it ties into ideas, in my opinion, of the social contract, where we can have these sort of, um, well, a little bit of a disagreement in terms of what is and isn't a matter of trust, depending on people's perception of what the commitment is. So, to sort of summarize that, I find that trust is the confidence that someone or something has the ability and or the intention to fulfill their commitments. Along the way, I really do encourage you, if you disagree with me on anything, please jot it down and mention it at the end. Critique me, question what I've said, express if you feel that I'm terribly incorrect, because it will be very useful to me to hear your thoughts. So, who do we trust? This is taken from an Ipsos poll from 2024 in the UK. The poll asked participants, yes or no, do you trust the following professions to tell the truth? At the top, we see nurses, engineers, doctors, professors. At the bottom, we see politicians generally, government ministers, advertising executives, and journalists. I show this because I think it's quite interesting just to see patterns of trust here in the UK. Um, I think it's also interesting to see who's at the top. I mean, we've got sort of professionals where it's difficult for us broadly, maybe, to comment on the knowledge of that profession. Whereas at the bottom, they are generally professions that most people will have access to do if they wanted to, particularly politicians, government ministers, advertising executives, roles that perhaps don't require the same amount of specialized training that nurses, engineers, doctors, professors may have to. Other thing that I found interesting, obviously 60% of people believe that the ordinary man or woman on the street would tell the truth. I found that quite interesting. What is this a measure of? To me, and going back to sort of this idea of what is trust and, those 3 points, ability, intention, commitment, I feel like this is just measuring intention. It's the way I see it. Do you think that these professions have good intentions, that they're going to tell the truth? The reason that I bring that up is I think there's some good questions, important questions that we need to ask about how do we measure trust. And I'd say that each of these components of trust do sort of have different ways of thinking about how we could go about measuring it. Importantly, I focus on ability and commitment in my research. So with ability, can, a person do something? To me, that draws on or can draw on geographies of power, and also literature on feminist geography and feminist theory broadly, who has the capability and the freedom to act and to do something. I think that that's all rather interesting on the ability side. On the intention side, it can get very philosophical, looking at philosophy of morality, attribution theory. These are things that I'm less familiar with. It's not been sort of core to my research. And finally, with commitment, which I do believe is, again, integral to this, to me, a lot of it draws on social contract theory and what those contracts and commitments are. Social contract theory broadly is what is the sort of contract, the agreements between state and citizen. However, I would say it goes a little bit broader. It's also sort of the contract between individuals, between different nodes of hierarchy within society. So we've looked at trust. What is resilience? And this here is the risk equation. For those of you who don't know me, I was an engineer before I returned to academia to do human and physical sort of merged geography. And so this is an equation that I had to use quite a lot in practice when we were doing lots of risk assessments. So breaking it down, we've got at the beginning probability of the hazard occurring. That's the first part of the risk equation. How likely is, say, a flood of a given magnitude going to happen? Next, we've got exposure. So the first part is spatial, the second part is temporal. So given that the hazard is going to happen, where is it going to hit? Where is our flood going to extend to? And given that it's going to extend to all of these places, when will it happen? But more specifically, who and what could it affect when it happens? Will someone be home or not? And then the final piece is vulnerability, and to me, that's where resilience fits. I'm going to read a couple definitions to you, just because I think that they're quite important to framing this. So vulnerability is defined by the UN as the conditions determined by physical, social, economic, and environmental factors or processes which increase the susceptibility of an individual, a community, assets, or systems to the impacts of hazards. The reason I've mentioned all of that is because, to me, susceptibility is the key piece here. And also remember that vulnerability is usually used, if not always used, in the context of probability. Going back to the risk equation, it's the probability of something happening. So it's tied to this idea of probability and susceptibility. Resilience is defined by the UN as the ability of a system, community, or society exposed to hazards to resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt to, transform, and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner. Okay, so I'm going to be, or try to be, careful with my words here so that I don't dig myself into a hole with how I define things. I've got a few circles here. The shaded in ones, the fully green ones, to me, represent knowns, and the sort of shaded out one with the dashed line is representing an unknown. What I'm trying to get at here is that, to me, vulnerability can always be known. It's always an estimate. Both vulnerability and resilience are always estimates, but it can be known in the sense that it's a probability about something happening in the future, some future susceptibility. So we can know our vulnerability before a disaster, and we can also do the same afterwards, because we're always looking at our susceptibility to something in the future. Resilience, however, integral to the definition of resilience is, all of these things with respect to how well are we able to adapt, to recover, to respond, to transform, and in a timely manner. We can only know all of this after some sort of an event has happened, whether that be a hazard event or a disaster itself. We can only know that after the fact. So beforehand, we don't really know resilience. We're guessing, we're estimating. Like I said, this is all an estimate, but we don't really know resilience until after the event. So why does this matter? If resilience is only truly known post-hazard event, then why not avoid measuring resilience pre-hazard? Why not just say we're measuring vulnerability, and then after the fact, we can see whether or not a system was resilient or not? My answer to that would be that's not the way that the word is used in the literature. The word is used in both ways. The word is used to describe pre-hazard and building resilience, but it's also used after the fact, despite the fact that the definition refers to post-hazard, how well you're able to cope. We still discuss resilience, rather, in the literature as something that can be measured beforehand. Okay, so if resilience has to be measured before the hazard, can we estimate it as inversely proportional to vulnerability? Now this is contested. I would say yes. I would say that truly vulnerability and resilience are different things. I agree. However, if we're going to be estimating resilience beforehand, essentially what we're doing is looking at the opposite of vulnerability. These are sort of different ways in which vulnerability is measured through social means, economic, institutional, the built environment, and the natural environment. These are the things that we look at. And a lot of the time, these are essentially measures of vulnerability also, just looking at them in reverse. So what does the literature say about trust and resilience? So earlier this year, myself and some colleagues had a paper published, a review article on trust and resilience. What's the relationship between them? So we looked at, I think, 100 or so articles. In those articles, obviously, they have various different relationships. They discuss numerous relationships between trust and resilience. And so I think at the end of the day, there were 200 something relationships that we looked at. And this diagram is showing that. So we see that 43% of these relationships looked at trust in the government. 20% looked at trust in communities, neighbours, family. 11% looked at trust in mitigation infrastructure, which is interesting. Going back to that idea before about trust, can you have trust in mitigation infrastructure? Is there a commitment? Is that really a trust? Is that really trust in the mitigation infrastructure, or is it more trust in the engineers or in the scientists? Is a question to be discussed, perhaps. We also looked at how these articles are measuring resilience. They measure it based on individual and household preparedness, risk perception, warnings and evacuation, whether people will heed warnings and evacuate. I'm at a particularly troublesome point in my PhD where nothing makes complete sense. And I'm struggling broadly with our measures of resilience because they're all problematic in certain ways. We can increase preparedness, that's broadly seen as a good thing, and a resilient thing, fantastic. But we don't know how well people have prepared. What if all of their stock is faulty or their food is out of date? Risk perception. What if just because, and the research shows this, just because people have higher risk perception doesn't necessarily mean they're more resilient, just means that they know more about the hazard. Just because someone evacuates or doesn't evacuate doesn't mean that they're more or less resilient necessarily. But anyway, we've measured them based on how they were discussed in these papers. And so green just shows an increase in resilience, red a decrease in resilience. And overall, if you bring everything together, trust just barely sort of increases resilience. But as you can see, there's a huge amount of nuance and trust in the government almost split between increasing and decreasing, even just resilience in preparedness. So the point being is that it can go lots of different ways. There's no clear-cut answer, and that's the point here. There's no clear-cut answer. So what are the gaps that we found in this? We found that a lot of the research has been conducted in Western countries, that a lot of the research is focused on single hazards or single disaster environments, and that a lot of the studies focus on just a single element of trust. And what I mean by that is just looking at one person or institution in which the public usually are trusting in. And a lot of the time it's in government. So for my PhD, I wanted to look at trust and resilience, and I needed to find somewhere that sort of addressed those gaps and those questions that I just presented before. So I landed on the Caribbean, specifically the island of Dominica, not to be confused with the Dominican Republic. Why Dominica? There's a lot of reasons why. Number one, Dominica was named the #1 most climate affected country in the world between 1993 and 2022, making it an interesting place to look at hazards broadly. Part of the reason why it was named that was that in 2017, they were hit by Hurricane Maria, which caused damages in excess of 230% of their GDP, also led to 65 fatalities. They were still recovering from Tropical Storm Erica, which had hit 2 years prior. And it's the most volcanic island potentially on Earth. Sorry, I should make that more clear. The most volcanic country on Earth in terms of the ratio between active volcanoes, which is 9, and the area, which is about half the size of metropolitan London. They have a population of around 60 to 70,000 people. Most of the island population is around the coast. Right now, we're looking right in the interior, which is thick tropical rainforest. It's a beautiful, beautiful island, obviously devastated by both Tropical Storm Erica and Maria. The capital city right here is Roseau. The population are majority descendant of African slaves. However, 5% of the population are indigenous. They are I believe, only remaining self-governing indigenous population in the Caribbean, the Kalinago, um, and they make up about 5% of the population. So importantly, Dominica have this big goal of becoming the world's first climate resilient nation. This is a goal that they started on after Hurricane Maria hit. In the days after Maria, they said, look, we've had Erica, we've had Maria, we are going to become the world's first climate resilient nation. So coming back to everything, we've looked at trust and what that means. We've looked at resilience and what that looks like. We've looked at trust and resilience in the literature. And we've sort of introduced here Dominica and given a little bit of a rationale for why. I mean, sneakily, the other reason why, which is very important, is the fact that I am of Dominican descent. So my dad's of Dominican descent. He grew up in Dominica, and so half my family are from the island. So it's very important to me. Obviously, there's some very interesting academic reasons, but culturally and for the sake of my heritage, it's been fantastic to get to do this research, and I'm very proud of it. It's a really beautiful and fantastic island. So, what does resilience look like in Dominica? So, as you can imagine, after they said that they want to become the world's first climate resilient nation, obviously they had to come up with a plan. So they created the Climate Resilience and Recovery Plan. And in that plan, they have these 6 areas, I think they call them pillars, that they need to achieve, essentially. And each of these pillars have sort of separate points that I'll get to in a moment. So we've got strong communities, robust economy, well-planned and durable infrastructure, protected and sustainably leveraged natural and other unique assets, strengthened institutional systems, and enhanced collective consciousness. So I read through their policy documents and I found themes, essentially. I did a document analysis and I found themes. And these themes, they cross between different pillars. However, more or less, they align with one more than others. So these themes could be like housing, for instance. As you can imagine, housing ties to a number of these, but some more than others. Strong communities, I believe, but also infrastructure, of course. So housing. What else have we got? Sort of aid. Well, aid doesn't come up as much in the policy, but aid as another factor. The point being is that there are all these different sub themes essentially. I don't know why I'm trying to remember them all because they're on the next screen anyway. So this is a graphic that is pulling this together. So in addition to doing an analysis of the policy, I also interviewed over 100 people and asked them, what does resilience mean to you? To look at what came through those conversations. So what we're seeing here is something quite interesting. We've got all of the themes that I identified in the interviews. Where I've got an asterisk, they also showed up in the they only showed up in the interviews rather. Everything else showed up in both the policy and in the interviews, which is important. So the way that I've categorized this, the way that I've sort of grouped it up, is based on the percentage of interviews in which any of these themes showed up in. So housing comes up number one. That's why it was the first thing that I remembered. So over 80% of people, when they're discussing what resilience looks like and what it means to them, housing is very important. It came up, like I say, 85%, I think, of the interviews, followed by financial resources, education and training, and then disaster aid. Again, I mentioned disaster aid previously, and the reason that it was on my mind is it's an interesting one. That disaster aid is the fourth most discussed term in terms of what resilience means to people in Dominica, yet it doesn't show up at all in the policy. So it was an interview only theme. The other interview only themes are evacuation, which is also interesting, mentality, faith, family, flexibility, adaptability, and activism. This is the same data, just organized in a slightly different way, and it's colored based on a sentiment analysis that I did. So as you can imagine, for all of those different interviews, for all of those different themes that I identified, obviously I have quotes that sort of back that up. So I did two passes of this where I went through each quote that for each of these themes, and I coded it. I gave it a number, -1 for negative sentiment, positive, just a 1 for positive, or 0 for neutral. And what I was looking for there was, how do people think, or like, where do people think Dominica is at, basically? Is this something that is currently good, bad, or so-so? To sort of yeah, to explain the process there. So I ran through it twice, just because, as you can imagine, it is quite subjective. I had sort of a bit of a planned approach to how to do this and what I was looking for in each quote. But as you can see, I definitely sort of erred on the side of neutral. So a lot of these, ultimately, their score was quite neutral, which is probably a good thing, that I erred on the side of neutral. But we do still see some standout negatives and positives. So the most negative, though obviously, again, take that with a grain of salt, but the most negative was resource availability. But I think what's more interesting is to just look at all of the negative sentiments together: resource availability, insurance, productivity, financial resources. And the point, or the story to be told there, is that these are elements of resilience that Dominicans identify as being important for them to become the world's first climate resilient nation. However, there are areas that they're not quite meeting yet, areas for improvement. On the flip side, we have the positives, the areas that are working well: flexibility, adaptability, mentality, self-reliance, faith, collective action, and engagement. These are areas that people identify as being important to resilience, and areas that people think, yeah, we're doing good on that. We're smashing it. This is the final figure on this particular data that I'll show, and it's again showing more or less the same thing, but breaking it down in one extra way. So for each of those themes, those little sub-themes, I've grouped them into those pillars from Dominica's policy plan, the Climate Resilience and Recovery Plan. On the left side, we see the resilient themes, the components that were discussed by less than 50% of the interviewees, so the minority. And on the right side, we see the themes discussed by the majority of people. And I think what to me is interesting here is what is discussed by the majority versus the minority. So we see on the majority side, more conversations around strong communities. And on the minority side, we see conversations around enhanced collective consciousness. So very few people relatively were talking about that. In fact, we don't see anyone talking about, or sorry, I shouldn't say that. We don't see any of the enhanced collective consciousness themes discussed by the majority of people. That's just not the way in which the majority are conceptualizing resilience. So why does all of this matter? To me, it matters because it's important to understand how resilience is conceptualized by the people if I am trying to measure resilience, and thus then measure how trust influences it or not. So in my survey that was taken by 550 people roughly in Dominica, almost 1% of the population, I measured preparedness. And so we see the actions that the majority of people have taken: storing food, learning about hazards, fixing their house, first aid. And we see the sort of total number of preparedness actions that people take, the median being 4. I also asked whether or not people intended to evacuate to a shelter. And we see that almost 50% of people, I think 46% of people, are sort of scoring 1 or 2. No, it's very unlikely that I would go to a shelter in the case of a disaster or a hazard event. Now, there are problems here, and this is another area that I would love for you to critique me on, and to, if you have any thoughts as to how I could do this better. Going back here, we see all of these different ways in which resilience is conceptualized. We see, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but obviously we see shelters as one very important piece, and we see preparedness as well. And that's essentially what I'm measuring. Shelters and preparedness is, but there are a whole lot of other, arguably more important components of resilience that I haven't done my analysis on. I do have data on how people perceive the resilience of their house, how people perceive the resilience of their finances, the national economy, and I currently haven't incorporated them into my picture of resilience when it comes to the statistical analysis. And of course, I'm very upfront with the fact that there are limitations here, as I already mentioned, with preparedness. How well have any of these measures been taken? With shelter intention, yeah, if someone goes to a shelter, that's great. But also going to a shelter might be the more dangerous thing to do for people who live really far away from shelters and they've got to walk miles and miles and miles to get there, probably through hazardous areas to get there. And also, if you are a multimillionaire with a fantastic house, with lots of resources, you might say, I have no intention of going to a shelter. That doesn't mean you're necessarily not resilient. It just means that you're not going to a shelter because you've got a fantastic, robust, hazard, resilient house. So you don't need to evacuate. So, in who and in what do people trust? I have a question here looking at whether people trust different institutions to be able to protect them or to recover from disasters. We see at the top, people trust themselves. At the bottom, we've got science/scientists, the government, and the communities. So people trust the scientists the least, or have the least amount of trust in scientists for recovery, and people have the least amount of trust in the community for protection. Going back to what I was saying before, I have to interpret these results really carefully. Just because there's low trust in the news for recovery doesn't mean that people distrust the news. It's possible and probable that they just don't see the news as being an important institution in terms of that commitment for recovery. So there's a lot of nuance through which this data has to be looked at. Trust in oneself is clearly a standout winner. It goes back to self-reliance being one of those key themes of resilience earlier. Here I looked at whether or not people trusted in institutions as sources of accurate information. We see news stand out. So people do trust the news more than anyone else. Local news, international news, social media, government. People don't trust, or the majority don't trust, family, scientists, community leaders, and the church community for accurate disaster information. I regret not asking this as a 7-point Likert like the previous question. It's a binary, but interesting, hopefully, nonetheless. So my final 2 slides. Is there a relationship between trust and resilience? So I'm going to show you some statistics and walk through them. I do obviously have interview data, qualitative data that also speaks to this relationship or the associations between them. I haven't yet written that up or finished that analysis, however, but I can speak to it. So what we're looking at here are a bunch of graphs, all showing statistically significant relationships between, in this slide, preparedness score, and in the next slide, shelter intention, and various predictors, some of which are trust. So the point is here that in the regression that I ran, I put a lot of variables in with the hope of finding out whether trust was an important factor when you included everything else. And essentially, yes. So if we walk through them, number 1, we see the number of hazards experienced. because it's, we've got this positive value, positive slope, what this is telling us is that the more hazards a person experiences, the more prepared they are. And that's statistically significant. So that's great. Next, we see trust in the house. So the more a person trusts that their house will protect them in a disaster event, the more prepared they happen to be. Interesting. The other ones with respect to trust, we see that the more a person trusts in science or scientists, the more prepared they were. The more a person trusted in community leaders for information, the more prepared they were. Very, very minor, but still statistically significant. And interestingly, the more a person placed trust in God or in faith, the less prepared they were, in the sense of the fewer preparedness actions they took. Again, it's not a huge difference, but it is a statistically significant difference nonetheless. Again, it goes back to that question of, there's a broader question there. Can one have trust in a divine power? Is that something that can even be within the remit of trust? Is there a commitment there? Again, it came up in the interviews as a place that people put trust in. People, it's a very Catholic island, placed a lot of trust in God. So it culturally makes sense to include it. This one is showing shelter intention. So we see, number one, the more a person trusts disaster shelters, the more likely they are to go to a shelter. Makes sense, but that's good to see. Very strong association there. So the next one for trust would be protective trust in the news or media. So the more likely a person is to trust in news and or media to protect them from disaster events, the more likely they are to go to a shelter. Same with if they place more trust in the information from community leaders, they're also more likely to go to a shelter. So we see negative relationships for trust in oneself. The more someone trusts in oneself, the less likely they are to go to a shelter. And we see the same for more trust in the government for information. So trusting in the government for information, the more trust you have in that, the less likely you are to go to a shelter. Interesting. And the more a person trusts in their house to protect them, the less likely they are to go to a shelter. As I mentioned before, I do have qualitative data also on these, which is sort of an interesting additional piece of data for me to go through. I think, to summarize and to answer the question from the beginning, so is there a relationship between trust and resilience? In Dominica, I mean, if we just break it down a little bit again, trust. There are people and institutions that people place trust in when it comes to disasters. I would say that predominantly that trust is placed from an individual in individuals. It would be in the government, institution / individuals, the government, in the news, a lot of trust in the news, in oneself, and in one sort of immediate network. There's also trust placed in non-human things such as infrastructure, which is interesting to see and important to note. Does that trust influence resilience actions? The statistics would say yes, but obviously this has been looking only at ability trust and only at preparedness and shelter intention as the measures of resilience. That's not all of resilience, it's just two components of it. So there are additional questions, I think, with the statistics that need to be answered in terms of, building a more robust model, essentially, to answer the question better in terms of that relationship between trust and resilience. So that's from the statistics side. From the qualitative side, there's just so many stories to unearth, and so many themes that I haven't had the chance to go through with you today. Just choosing one very quickly, we saw that housing was the number one, um, housing was the number one sort of most discussed theme of resilience. So if we were to think about the relationship between trust and resilience there, it's very interesting because after Hurricane Maria, aid distribution was politicized. This is something that was discussed in many, many, many interviews, in that whether or not a person received aid, whether or not a person received housing or housing material after the hurricane depended on, in part, whether or not they had supported the incumbent government in the previous election. Now, like I say, this was something that was brought up in multiple interviews, but as a result, I do think it influences people's relationship with the government and with aid and with expectations of sort of housing stock post disaster. Um, I think it's a different regime now than it was before. I think it also just shapes where people are placing their trust and whether or not that trust is valid. If you supported the government and you trusted the government and you got assistance, it makes sense to continue trusting the government. They were there for you and they helped you. If you trusted the government and you hadn't supported them and you didn't get aid, it also makes sense to not trust them in the future, at least with respect to um, getting aid or assistance in the future. I will leave the presentation there. As you can see, just by discussing housing, there's a million different themes here that I could go on and on and on about. And if you want to hear me go on and on and on about, I invite you to read my thesis when it's written, and then you can get all of it in immense, immense detail. Um, but what I do want to say though is that yeah, this has just been the most brilliant, brilliant adventure of my life. It's been an immense joy and immense privilege. I'm very grateful to you all for your attention and for your interest in this presentation. So thank you. I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to take any questions. Cheers.